Hello YouTube. I have published videos about Central Asia before, and you will find them in the playlist titled Central Asia in my channel. I urge my audience and people in other parts of the world to acquaint themselves with this fascinating part of Eurasia. Suffice it to say, some of the areas I will describe in this video today were investigated by top secret scientists and those involved with the research of the Soviet UFO research program Setka. The cases they looked at are some of the most striking in the global ufology, of course unknown basically outside the Soviet Union. Please check them out, and please find out in this video about more sinister paranormal or unusual phenomena in Central Asia, in the areas like the Usturt, like the Karakum desert. The story I'm about to tell you is about the dark secrets of the late USSR, about the greed and frivolity with which people abuse nature. The thoughtless intrusion into the surrounding environment always goes sideways. Of course, not only in the former USSR. Sometimes this intrusion generates real horrors, worthy of the darkest fiction. Unfortunately, this intrusion was basically taking place under the system of the Soviet socialism, and very few people knew about this. I remember seeing scars left by basically untamed projects, and we already know about Chernobyl, we know about the Ural horrors, but today we'll talk about Central Asia. Andrei Lanius first heard about the monsters of the Sarykamysh basin when he parted with his profession as an engineer. Because of the set of circumstances, he retrained himself as a correspondent and worked for the newspaper Pravda Vostoka. He never traveled to Karakalpakia or Karakalpakstan as a journalist, but information about this amazing region continued to flow to him through many channels. Now it seems to him that he solved the mystery, although he doesn't have more solid evidence to back it up. But let's go step by step. Almost any modern map of Central Asia shows the Sarykamysh Lake, which is adjacent to the Usturt Plateau from the southeast. Its area about 3,000 square kilometers. The blue threads of the watercourses connecting the lake with the Amudarya are also shown, but on the maps made before 1971, there is no lake there, but there is a Sarykamysh basin or depression. The fact is that in the Soviet times, the lion's share of irrigated land in Central Asia was occupied by cotton. In the fall-winter period, cotton plantations needed to be washed. Water was released from the reservoirs through a system of irrigation channels. All the toxic chemicals remaining in the soil after harvesting were dissolved in this washing water. The water saturated with poisons was no longer subject to purification. It was also taken through channels and chutes to some desert area and just there simply dumped into a suitable lowland. Thus, a whole necklace of poisonous lakes was formed throughout the cotton growing zone, and the largest of them was just Sarykamysh, which lay on the path of the old dry Daryalik riverbed. And the blue threads on the map are the discharge channels through which the poisoned moisture was discharged. The rapid filling of the basin has been taking place since the early 1970s. Today it is even difficult to calculate approximately how many pesticides have accumulated over the years of intensive cotton growing. in this natural bowl, the bottom of which lies 45 meters below sea level. It seemed, however, as if nature itself had taken care to restrict access to these shores to any living creature. From the west and northeast, the cliffs of Usturt hung over the lake. From the north stretched the Karakum mountain with the highest point of 292 meters. And from the south and east, the approaches to the cesspool were guarded by the Karakum sands. In addition, due to fluctuations in the water level in the lake, its coastline has turned into an impassable swamp in many areas. No Western science fiction writer could have dreamt of such a lost world. And the stories about this surreal lost world were correct. The first story was told to Lanius by a former colleague of his grandfather. The name was Gennady Alexeyevich. As the source of this account, he referred to his driver, whom he believed implicitly, and who was an experienced, sober, responsible driver, Mikhail. He traveled a lot in Karakalpakstan, working on the construction of the Central Asia Center gas pipeline. So here's what the driver Mikhail told them. One day I received a telegram from Krasnovodsk. My best friend invited me to a wedding. In 2 days. It's summer now, plane tickets are tight. Then my boss, a Turkmen, offered to take his car, the Volga. And he said, if you leave in the morning, you can be there the next day. At the same time, he warned, stay away from Sarykamysh. People say that there are some mysterious forces at work there. The next morning, when it was still dark, I left. During the first 2 hours, I drove carelessly through the salt marshes and takirs. It refers to dry, briny areas of soil, hard as asphalt. But now he began to meet Pukhlyak, and this is the most dangerous thing in a deserted area, especially for a passenger car. I don't know a word for Pukhlyak in English, but you will know what it is as I go on. If the car starts sliding on the takir, the upper dense crust and the loose layer lying under it will quickly turn into the smallest, weightless dust that flows like water in a hand. That's Pukhlyak. In it, the wheel has nothing to catch on. It rolls and rolls in vain, only getting settled even deeper. Gradually my eyes began to close. I couldn't get enough sleep the night before. Yes, the monotony of the landscape lulled me to sleep, and not a single car in sight, neither oncoming nor passing. Suddenly, out of the corner of my mind, I realized that I was dreaming, and for a long time I braked sharply. The car was parked among stunted bushes. There was no track. There were no footprints on the sun-baked surface of the salt marsh. I climbed onto the roof and looked around. Nothing. A continuous monotonous silence. Finally, far away, at the very horizon line, I saw a tiny black dot. I got back behind the wheel, and after a couple of minutes, I drove onto a shallow track. It led in the right direction to the marked point. It was a Zhiguli, Soviet car, and a running one. Only the windows were broken and the left door was turned sideways. The key was stuck in the ignition and the tank was 2/3 full of gasoline, but not a living soul nearby. The car was sitting in a Pukhlyak down to its very axles. It was impossible to break it out of captivity just by its own efforts. Obviously, the driver went to get help, but why didn't he pull out the ignition key? I looked around again. Something glinted off to the side. Expensive gold-rimmed glasses, completely intact. It became somehow alarming, but I tried to calm myself down. After all, there is a track in front of me. Someone has passed here, so I will pass too. Soon I saw a new dark speck ahead. It was already at that time a whole zeal, that's another Soviet vehicle, half drowned in the Pukhlyak. I must admit, I have not heard of such a thing. My anxiety increased. Armed with a crowbar, just in case, I approached the border of the Pukhlyak. And then there was a dry rustling behind me. I turned around quickly. Something inexplicable was happening. It was as if a section of the salt marsh came to life and breathed. A puddle formed around a Pukhlyak formed around my car by itself, and then an unprecedented creature of speckled earthy colors, similar to a crocodile, but not a crocodile, with a long serpentine tail, rose from the Pukhlyak. After it, the second, the third, showing their terrible toothy mouths and stepping over with elastic-clawed paws, they moved towards me. I am afraid that there is a certain gap in my memory here. My mind refused to believe what was happening. It was as if some other person acted instead of me. He threw the crowbar at the nearest crocodile, and it seems did not miss. Ran without understanding the road to the hill, fell, got up, and ran again, believing that there, behind the hill, is salvation. And here I am on the crest. But then the ground was swimming under my feet. I was falling down somewhere. The last thing that remains in my memory is the sun's glare on the lake and a distant blue thread trembling in the sultry haze. I was lucky. I landed on the most extreme cliff, the wall of which had a certain slope. I slid down it, losing consciousness from stress, but all the bones were intact. At the same time, I was saved from the monsters. I don't know what kind of animals they are. In the evening, I came across a rusty cab from a tractor, abandoned tractor, and spent the night in it. In the morning, I moved on. About noontime, I met the irrigation workers. I hitched a ride to Kungrad in the evening and went to our crane operator Kurban. He believed every word I said, called two friends, they took rifles, and in the morning we drove a truck with a winch to those very cliffs. The Volga car was still standing in the Pukhlyak, but the windows were broken, the provisions were gone. No creatures were seen either. We got the car out. Later I wanted to restore it at my own expense, but the boss said, "Do not, Misha, it was Allah who saved you." About a year after the meeting with Gennady Alexeyevich, journalist Lanius went on a business trip to the Karshinsky steppe, or the Karshinsky plain, to the drilling site to make a report about the team that was looking for oil. And it turned out that the Foreman, before the Karshinsky steppe project, worked at the junction of Karakalpakia and Turkmenistan, where an incident occurred with him, which strangely complemented what Gennady Alexeyevich told Lanius about before. And Lanius saved a notebook with a summary of his story. So the foreman, Nikolai Kovalchuk, recalled the following. Just you, my audience, remember, Saiga is a critically endangered antelope, which during antiquity inhabited a vast area of the Eurasian steppe. You can still find it in Central Asia. Gazik is an all-terrain Soviet vehicle, Gaz. That's how we called it, Gazik. A good car, by the way. The Sarykamysh basin closes in the northwest with another depression, Asake Audan, which lies slightly higher, so the water doesn't flood it. About 5 years ago, our team conducted a test drilling there. The conditions are harsh, of course. No one brought us lunches from the restaurant. So we diversified our modest table with saiga hunting. They're not scared there. We hunted them in turn and always from 2 cars. And then one day, 2 of our people went for the fresh meat. They embarked on a gazik and a truck. Less than an hour has passed and we see the gazik is speeding back. In it, both of our hunters are pale and frightened. It turned out that they noticed the saigas and began to go around the herd from 2 sides. Suddenly the ground swelled up in the truck's path and it found itself in the middle of the puhlyak, inside of which something alive and powerful was jumping. Our guy was smart enough not to leap down from the cab. He climbed into the back and jumped from there to Takir. And run away he did. The second in the gazik noticed this incomprehensible maneuver and rushed to meet his partner. And then several creepy creatures, similar to huge crocodiles, allegedly got out of the puhlyak. Our messengers rushed to the drilling site. One of their guns was left in the truck, and they did not dare to use the second one. They said it is unknown how many of these creatures were there. We took another gun, armed ourselves with hooks and axes, and went there with like the entire brigade. The truck was sitting in the puhlyak on the very axles. I had to drive a tractor here. We were stuck all day. All the men were swearing terribly. No one believed the hunters. They say they drove the car into the puhlyak out of perplexity and made up a story about the monsters. I did not believe it either. But when we pulled out the truck and drove around this place through a distant hill, we saw an eerie picture, a cluster of saiga skeletons, not so clean that they could even be put in a museum. Who could have done it? After all, poachers never cut up their prey on the spot, and even so carefully. And later, Lanius had opportunities to hear from the shepherds the stories about the monsters of the Sarykamysh lake, which they called Karkidons. Translated from the Turkic, it means crocodile. However, he did not have a chance to see them himself. Lanius heard the third story about 3 years later, when he was treated at the Tashkent Cardiology Center. In one of the wards, there was a strong, fair-haired guy with whom Lanius became friends, and they often talked. Sergei, a pilot of small aircraft, for many years worked in Karakum, and here is his story. This happened when I switched from passenger transportation to agricultural aviation. My aunt, too, was based at a dirt airfield near Nukus. I was friends with a good guy from the locals. His name was Amangeldi. He served as a hunter in the Nurun Tubek Nature Reserve. Once we were sitting with him on the bank of the canal in the shade of the Turanga, it's a local poplar, and we were having a dignified conversation. Suddenly, about 20 meters away from us, on the opposite bank from a Tugai coastal thickets, crawls out a kind of a monster, a real crocodile, only the paws are longer and the tail is like a hose, round and nimble. From the head to the base of the tail, it was 1.5 meters in size, and the same amount from the tail for the tail itself. He looked at us with round eyes and was not very scared, stood for a while and disappeared back into the Dukai. What kind of an animal is this? I turned to Amangeldi. People call it Karkidon, the hunter replied. He came here a month ago, but people say, Amangeldi for some reason switched to a whisper, that there are many such beings near Sarykamysh, and they are much more in size than this one. It looks like a monitor lizard, but they're small and not dangerous, those lizards. And these ones hunt saigas, steal sheep, and even attack people. No one knows where they came from. 3 stories from different sources, which had many overlapping details. They had to be explained in his mind to Lanius. Of course, giant monitor lizards are known in nature. For example, on some islands on the Malay archipelago, the Komodo lizard, the largest of the modern lizard, that's where it lives. The length of its torso can exceed 3 meters, and the weight is 150 kilograms. It digs long burrows, swims quite well. It's a predator, and it feeds on hoofed animals, monkeys, carrion. It also attacks people, especially aggressive during the mating season. Yes, but how could these Komodo lizards, appear in the depths of Central Asia? At the same time, Lanius found a prerequisite for a possible answer in the Encyclopedia of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic. It said that the animals of the Central Asian deserts gradually acquired a number of features that allowed them to exist in difficult conditions. In particular, lizards, which include the gray monitor lizard, have adapted to rapid movement, and not only due to elongated limbs, but also longer feet and tail. In addition, they have outgrowth on the feet in the form of bristly brushes or horny teeth. These features favor movement on a loose substrate and burrowing in loose soil. That is, as a result of the changed environmental conditions, the same gray monitor lizards could undergo some mutations. The impetus that triggered the mutation mechanism could be the toxic chemicals that enter the Sarykamysh basin by the tons. So within 3 or 4 generations, that is just by the mid-1970s, to which all 3 stories belong to the time period, that's where the lizards appeared in the deserted area around Sarykamysh, due to mutations comparable in size to their distant Komodo relatives. The common gray monitor lizard is also a predator, feeding mainly on snakes, jerboa, and birds. But now it needed bigger prey. It is in principle at hand, if they looked around. Saiga, gazelles, roe deer. But see, that prey is too fast-footed. You need to catch up with it. Yet nature itself suggests a way out. For the Karkidons, giant monitor lizards began to hunt together, having developed a cunning tactic. They crept up to the same saigas under the crust of Takir, then in a matter of seconds turned the herd's escape routes into a deep puhlyak, in which the footed animals were stuck. Lunch is ready and served. It must be assumed that in a similar way, monitor lizards could hunt down humans, at least in rare cases, sneaking up to lonely cars that stopped in the wilderness. But if everything was like this or something like this, then reasonable questions come up. Why was there a conspiracy of silence around the Karkidons on the part of the authorities, and where did these mutants disappear to? The first reports of the monsters date back to 1974-75. Shepherds, geologists, drivers, builders encounter Karkidons or traces of their presence. The appearance of bloodthirsty creatures is increasingly being whispered about in local tea houses and bazaars. The peak of this wave of rumors falls on the period of 1978, about the autumn time, the fall time, okay? And what about the local authorities? They, of course, procrastinate for a long time. Is it worth believing the stories of superstitious shepherds? Finally, the information from the local places still goes up. But just then, a global project of transferring part of the runoff of Siberian rivers to Central Asia was at the decision stage in front of the Soviet leadership. One of the grandiose and idiotic plans of the Soviets, it had to alter the environment. The then leader of Uzbekistan, Sharaf Rashidov, lobbied especially actively, finding understanding among the top officials of the state. It has come to the point that the project organizations have already joined the implementation of the idea. True, there were also sober voices in the media, especially in the central media, but the general tone was determination to proceed. And suddenly you hear of man-eating mutants. What a trump card in the hands of the opponents of the project of the century. What a howling, what screaming all these greens will raise both at home and abroad, and how the image of the Soviet state will suffer in the eyes of the world community. So that such outrages could happen under the all-seeing eyes of the Communist Party, and all this during the preparations for the Moscow Olympics? No materials about giant monitor lizards could be allowed to appear in Soviet newspapers at that time. And what was Lanius supposed to do with this material, which was asking for the newspaper coverage itself? So he found a solution, and you have to live in totalitarian states to understand what he did. Or maybe you could sympathize him while you still live in a free world. And then he wrote this fantasy story. However, the monitor lizards were not suitable for the story that he wrote. They were too traditional to be characters. So for his story that he published, he invented sand stingrays, giving them the ability to absorb even iron. They hid in Pukhlyak and under takirs, waiting for lonely travelers. Everything happened, of course, on the steward, but he moved this action from the Sarykamysh basin deep into the plateau to get away from the topic of pesticides, a forbidden topic. His sand stingray was not the result of a mutation, but just one of the mysteries of nature. Lanius gave the name to the story, Be Afraid of the Sands, and he published it in the magazine around the world, and later it lived an independent life. There were even essays by other authors where his sand stingray appeared. Lanius later stated, with all the responsibility, that there are no sandrays under Stewart, and there were never any stingrays, sand stingrays. In fact, in the area of the Sarykamysh depression, apparently giant monitor lizards lived at one time. They lived for a short time, from about 1976 to 1978, and then they suddenly disappeared. He hypothesized or supposed that perhaps they were secretly exterminated during the unprecedented military exercises that took place on the territory of the Turkestan military district in March of 1979, just on the eve of the entry of Soviet troops into Afghanistan, secretly, for the same reason, in order not to give an argument to the opponents of the project to change the flow of the Siberian rivers and to avoid an international scandal. Of course, this is only an unsubstantiated hypothesis, and he knows that. And that's what he says. Now, today, the border between the two independent states, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, passes through the Sarykamysh basin. They are hatching another global project to create a second Baikal, Lake Baikal, in the center of the desert, where the waters of Lake Sarykamysh can be directed. And it is already drying up. Numerous islands have appeared on it. Surprisingly, even today, there are fishing teams in Sarykamysh, although environmentalists do not tire of reminding that the content of toxic substances in the tissues of Sarykamysh fish repeatedly exceeds all imaginable limits. But ask Lanius, who listens to environmentalists nowadays? If, nevertheless, the Sarykamysh lake dries up, it doesn't matter whether due to evaporation or due to water transfer, then its bottom will be exposed, which is a significant layer of toxic deposits. The wind and birds will spread the poisonous particles over a huge area. The consequences of this process are unpredictable. So this is the first episode, so to say. But now let's look at another, even less a phenomenon that can be explained, also in the general area. It comes from other sources, and I have been trying to find a confirmation of this story. I think the story has been hushed up. We will see. Let me share it with you. I love Central Asia and the people who live there, and the culture, and tremendous secrets that are hidden in the sense of its deserts and history, which may be unequaled in many ways to other parts of the world. But let's go through this story, and in the future I'll tell you more about Central Asia. Anyway, in the summer of 2003, the joint Russian-Turkmen medical and biological expedition Protuberanets conducted research in the Karakum desert. The purpose of the expedition was to find out the peculiarities of the impact of a dry, hot climate on the human body and to determine the optimal behavior in the desert conditions. The research had not only academic but also practical significance. Most of the territory of Turkmenistan is a desert. Employees of the industries for extraction of fossil fuels, geologists, the military, have to spend many days under the scorching sun at temperature of 40 to 45 degrees and sometimes even more. That would be Celsius. An increase in working capacity under these conditions promises significant economic benefits. So at first, 8 people in the expedition went to the sands, but 2 weeks later, there were just 3 of them. The condition of the others worsened so much that they stopped the experiment for themselves. Musa Islambekov, Ivan Fyodorov, and Boris Kovtun walked through the desert for about 5 hours every day, moving around the base camp, located 60 kilometers southwest of the village of Sayat, on the border of the Repetek Reserve. Walking served as a useful physical activity, which military personnel or geologists are subjected to. They took with them a compass, a radio telephone, a supply of salted water, and Kalashnikov assault rifles. It is also not safe in the desert nowadays, okay? Musa Islambekov, a relative of a high-ranking Turkmen official, provided the expedition with weapons, communications, and agreed that if necessary, they would be supported by a military unit stationed nearby. On the night of July 16, 2003, the members of the expedition saw a luminous disk with an angular size for about 10 minutes, a third of the diameter of the moon. That was the sign. And it was moving across the sky to the south of them, which soon disappeared behind the dunes. The movement was made noiselessly, but a few minutes after the disk disappeared from the sight, they heard a low, almost audible rumble, resembling a distant thunderclap. Having determined the azimuth, they agreed to go the next day and see what in fact it was. What if a helicopter crashed in the desert, or more appropriately a weather balloon? So they left in the morning. The first 3 hours of the journey did not lead to anything unexpected, and they were going to turn back. At the last moment, from the top of another dune, Ivan Fyodorov saw a shiny surface ahead, strikingly resembling a small lake. Mirage, optical phenomena caused by the curvature of rays in unevenly heated layers of air, have already been encountered by researchers, But now the mirage, if it was a mirage, looked somewhat different. Very clear boundaries, immobility, and the special charcoal shade of the surface forced them to come closer. The lake did not go away, and soon they were standing 30 meters from the black, oily, glistening surface. They were convinced that it was not a mirage, but it was not a lake either, since the surface relief was uneven, repeating the structure of the sands. Most of all, it looked like a film, a black polymer film spread out on the sand, a rounded shape measuring 20 to 25 meters. From this spot, they agreed to call the formation a spot for now, came the smell of ozone, sharp, intense, and after a few minutes, all three began to feel dizzy. Perhaps the heads were still spinning because the temperature had risen to 55 degrees in the sun, and there was no shade at all, except for the one provided by the umbrellas, a well-forgotten but proved effective remedy for sunstroke. Well, Ivan Fyodorov wanted to get close to the spot, but before reaching 10 steps, he almost lost consciousness, dropped the machine gun, and barely managed to crawl back to his comrades. They ran up to meet him, took Fyodorov away, arranged a halt under a tent made of a special fabric reflecting the sun's rays. Fyodorov was unable to continue his journey. Under the protection of the tent, Fyodorov's condition improved, and he was able to talk about what happened. As he approached this spot, he felt as if the air around him was thickening, and every movement required more and more effort. Finally, it was as if he broke through the veil and stepped freely, but immediately his whole body was shaken by a convulsion, as if from a strong shock of an electric discharge. And perhaps it was an electric discharge. In favor of the electrical nature of the phenomenon, it was also said that it was not possible to contact either the military unit or the Sayat, where the representative of the Islam Bekov clan lived, by the radio telephone that they had. They couldn't do it. After discussing the incident, they concluded that the blow was still thermal, but they considered it better to go for the machine gun after the sunset, when the heat subsides. From here, from a distance, the spot could not be seen from under the tent, but the participants of the expedition suggested that it could represent either, indeed, a polymer film or some chemical substance, possibly dropped yesterday from an object flying over the desert, a poisonous substance, and its fumes are toxic. That's why Fedotov felt unwell. After sunset, the temperature will drop and evaporation of the substance will decrease, and then with less danger it will be possible to come closer and pick up the weapon. From time to time, strange incomprehensible sounds came to them from the direction of the spot, like the wind rustling in the crowns of trees. Kovtun came out from under the tent, looked from a distance, but he could not establish the cause of the sound, which undoubtedly came from the spot, and he was not going to get closer, knowing that the desert does not tolerate frivolity. One victim is more than enough for them. The second would make the situation critical. Immediately after sunset, the temperature dropped rapidly, but they waited for about half an hour, assembling the tent and preparing for the return journey. The light wind that had risen should have dispersed the vapors, if there were any vapors, to begin with. When the allotted time had passed, Kovtun went to the abandoned weapon, and like Fedotov, 15 paces from the spot, he felt an inexplicable resistance to movement. 4 or 5 steps, and the obstacles disappeared. He hurriedly bent down to the machine gun, picked it up, and examined the spot. The surface of the spot was confusing. Purple lights ran along it, flashing and disappearing with a barely audible crackle. At first, evenly scattered throughout the spot, they ran to the edge at which Kovtun was standing. The latter hurried away, remembering the electric discharge that struck Fedotov. When he was 25 paces away, he looked back. The spot was changing shape. Now it looked more like an amoeba that had released a pseudopod, an amoeba trailing after a person. An uncontrollable, unaccountable fear forced him to fire at the spot with a machine gun, but the bullets had no visible effect. Joining his comrades, Kovtun barely had time to describe what happened, but then they noticed the spot moved towards them. They decided to move away to a safe distance, but the speed of the movement of the spot was not much inferior to the speed of the researchers. Because of Fedotov, who felt weak, they walked very slowly. The matter was aggravated by the fact that the compass was out of order and stubbornly pointed not to the north but to the approaching spot. They had to navigate by the stars. After an hour of traveling, Fedotov began to run out of strength. From the very beginning of the return journey, his comrades freed him from the load. But this helped only for a short time. Hastily finishing the rest of the water, they got rid of unnecessary things, except for weapons and this radio telephone. It became easier. Islam Bekov and Kovtun were able to support Fedotov, but the spot during the forced stop managed to get almost close, very close. For a while, they were able to go faster. But then the strength left Fedotov again. Feeling that he was delaying his comrades, he asked to leave him because, as he said, the spot would not cause any harm, but continuing the movement would certainly kill him. He needs 2 or 3 hours of rest, vitally. Give him a machine gun just in case, and go to the camp, which is already not far away. And he will take a breath and at the same time observe this strange spot. They didn't want to leave their friend, but Fedotov conditions really did not allow him to continue on his way. There was about an hour of fast walking left to the camp, and 3, if not more, if you walk slow. There was a stationary radio transmitter in the camp, with the help of which it was possible to call a helicopter from the military unit to evacuate Fedotov. They had to decide immediately. The spot was creeping up. Having once again offering their comrade to continue his journey and receiving decisive refusal, Islam Bekov and Kovtun hurried to the camp. The dune hid their comrade and the spot. No screams or shots were heard from there. Almost running, they reached the camp, contacted the base by radio. The helicopter was promised to be sent immediately after the sunrise. That was about 3 hours away. An hour later, they noticed purple lights on the crest of the dune. The spot was very close, but now it was clearly crawling more slowly. When the spot completely crossed the dune, it was clear that its size had almost doubled compared to the previous one. It was heavier, but it was steadily going for people. For what purpose? They should have assumed the worst. The spot is an unknown life form, but a predatory form. They again tried to fire at the spot, but apart from an increase in the number of purple lights, they did not notice any other consequences. There was a smell of ozone, weakness, nausea rolled over. Any movement was given with great difficulty. At times, attacks of paralyzing fear seized both of them. When the fear receded for a moment, Islam Bekov decided to experiment. Uncorking a plastic bottle of water, he threw it into the center of the spot. The water produced the effect of acid. A bold spot was formed about a square meter, and where the water poured out of the neck in flight, the spot was cut almost in two. The spot transformed the shape so as to bypass the area moistened with water. Then Islam Bekov and Kovtun threw another bottle each. The spot crawled back and disappeared behind the dune, but both researchers were completely exhausted and lay at the tents until sunrise. When the helicopter arrived, Islam Bekov and Kovtun were picked up in a semi-conscious state. On the way to the base, the helicopter pilots made several circles in the hope of finding their comrade, but he disappeared. Islam Bekov and Kovtun spent about 2 weeks in a military hospital recovering from the desert. During this time, the helicopter repeatedly examined the area indicated by Islam Bekov, but it was not possible to find either the mysterious spot or their comrade. According to military doctors, the participants of the expedition fell a victim to heat stroke, while the upset consciousness drew an image of a certain spot. Their comrade ran away into the desert, where he was covered with sand, and the others managed to escape. Boris Kovtun doubts one hallucination could not have been dreamt by both of them. He believes that the Turkmen military, pursuing an organized gang, used chemical weapons, possibly of the psychotogenic type. This hotbed was mistaken for a spot, but everything else was really a hallucination. And finally, Musa Islam Bekov is sure that they have met with the organosilicon being. Organosilicon compounds are organometallic compounds containing carbon-silicon bonds. Legends about the strange inhabitants of the desert are known among the Turkmen and other people, and they're not an invention, not a fantasy. One of the legends talks about a sand beast that lives under the sand, but during the day it appears on the surface and absorbs the sun's rays. It is deadly dangerous to approach it, but the beast, from the description, rather a fungus-like creature, is very afraid of water. It was this legend that led Musa to the idea of throwing a bottle of water into the spot, which is the sand beast. Well, on August 2nd, 2003, Islam Bekov, together with his friends, again went to the border of the Repetek Reserve to search for the sand beast. But there is no update as what has happened to them, and if I will ever find out, I will let you know. I want to have more confirmation of this story. But I gotta tell you, there's a lot of interesting phenomena in Central Asia. I hope to bring you more videos. If you like my research, please support it through the links in the description to this channel. Please subscribe to my channel and tell others. Thank you.